We are at Sunderland Minster, a church in the heart of the city centre that's been destroyed and rebuilt many times since the Vikings first razed it to the ground in the 9th century. Now it is a fine arts and crafts building with a thriving congregation. Here with me is Catherine McKinnell, the Minister for School Standards in the Department for Education and the Labour MP for Newcastle North. Since being elected in 2010, she's also shadowed the Solicitor General and Treasury briefs. She trained as an employment solicitor, and last month she completed the Great North Run in 2 hours and 32 minutes, which, Catherine, sounds to me like a pretty good time.
Do you know, I was absolutely delighted to make it to the end because that was my goal and I was just so focused on it. I was amazed that I made it in the time I did. But do you know what? It was down to the amazing crowds. I've never seen or experienced anything like it. The North East is awesome, but that day it was the most awesome I've ever seen it.
Well, congratulations. So Jake Berry is a former Conservative Party chairman, and he was the MP for Rossendale and Darwin in Lancashire until he lost his seat in the summer. In Parliament, he sat on David Cameron's policy board, and he was Minister for the Northern Powerhouse. And 2 years ago, he was knighted for service to the north of England. Are you missing Parliament, Jake Berry?
A little bit.
There we are. Rod Liddle is the associate editor of The Spectator and a columnist for The Sunday Times and The Sun. He's had a long career in journalism, including a period as the editor of Radio 4's Today programme. He's also the author of several books, and in the recent election he stood for the Social Democratic Party. He didn't win, but he said at the time, there is no great enthusiasm for Labour and there's certainly no enthusiasm for the Tories. I think these parties are out of date and useless. Rod Liddle, I'm guessing you haven't changed your mind?
No, but then there wasn't a great appetite for me either, which I found slightly depressing, unless you took the view, as I did, to the returning officer, that 16,000 of my votes had been mislaid, which I tried to suggest to them, but which they just brushed aside. They call that democracy, you know.
Eleanor Shearer is a novelist and senior research fellow at the left-leaning think tank Commonwealth. Her fiction explores the legacy of slavery in the Caribbean. Her grandparents were part of the Windrush generation. Eleanor's policy research focuses on corporate power and democratising the economy. And 10 years ago, she was the World Schools Debating Champion. Eleanor, it feels like you're in the right place tonight.
Absolutely. This has got nothing on the 2014 final in Thailand against South Africa.
Well, we'll try our best. We'll try our best. Sunderland, please welcome your Any Questions panel. So let's get going with our first, which comes from Laura Murrell. Hello, Laura.
Hello. I would like to ask, does the panel agree that the UK should consider paying reparations to Commonwealth countries?
Laura, thank you. This has been a topic of discussion as the Commonwealth heads of government meet in Samoa. There are some Commonwealth countries who wanted to see this in the final communique. Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, is among those who didn't, saying the focus should be on today's challenges. Catherine McKinnell, why? Why is that the approach?
So, I mean, I think it is really important that we all understand our past and our heritage and how we've arrived at where we are today and learn from our past as well. Obviously, as a education minister and a historian by background before I went into the law, I'm really interested in our history and our past, and we're in this amazing historic building tonight. But I do think that our energy and our focus has to be using what we know about our past to really drive and build a better today and a better future. And I think we have an amazing opportunity as a new government to really work on that global scale, to work with countries that we know are facing huge challenges on climate change, on, we know, sort of global pandemics, healthcare issues. There is so much we can do to work internationally with international partners to build a better and brighter future. And I think as a government, that is where all of our focus and energy will go.
Why can't you focus on the future and acknowledge the past, even perhaps in terms of a formal apology?
I think there is a really important role in acknowledging the past and understanding what has built our society and what we have learned from the past. But I do think that we could spend an awful lot of time looking backwards, and it would take away that energy and drive to really look forwards and build that future that we need to build, whether that's issues here in the UK or whether that's internationally. And I think as a global looking party, we're really focused on building those international relationships that can, on the issues that we know don't just affect us here in the UK, but that we need to work internationally to really tackle.
OK. Eleanor Shearer, the focus should be on the future, Labour says.
I think that's a bit of a misunderstanding about what reparatory justice really is. It is about looking back to go forward. I mean, Catherine mentioned there the issue of climate. There was a report recently by the Climate Community Institute in the US that looked at the fact that Caribbean countries are really heavily indebted, in large part because of their imperial legacy, the legacy of poor public health, of poor education, of poorly diversified economies. These countries now find themselves at the forefront of a climate crisis not of their own making. And it's about $2.7 billion every year going out of the region to service that debt. That, coincidentally, is about exactly the amount, $2.75 billion, that the UN says these countries need to fight climate action. So when we talk about paying reparations, I think it's very easy to get sucked into immediately thinking about, the UK paying certain sums of money. But one thing the UK government could practically do today is be leading the charge at the IMF, at the World Bank, saying those debts should be forgiven in order for the Caribbean to move forward and combat the climate crisis. And if I may just finish on something personal here, because I think the other thing we need to remember is that sometimes we talk about things like slavery as if they're really ancient history. There's a British government commission into labour conditions in the West Indies in the 1930s after a series of unrest there. The findings of the Commission were so bad in terms of what people were enduring, the lives that they were living, that its publication was suppressed until after the Second World War to avoid giving propaganda to the Nazis. The Moyne Commission arrived in the Caribbean in 1938. My grandfather was 8 years old. I just don't think it's credible to say that this isn't history that is shaping the present.
OK. Rod Liddle.
I think it's very difficult. It's difficult, first of all, to find who is culpable. Clearly, the United Kingdom was culpable in that it instituted slavery in West Africa and continued with it for a couple of hundred years before being one of the first countries in the world to outlaw the practice. So there is a culpability there, but there's also a culpability, of course, amongst the African countries who themselves provided the slaves to the Western European powers. And you will hear no more strident voices against the idea of reparations than those from the Gambia, from Ghana, who feel that they could be well and truly clobbered if this sort of thing went ahead. And then you wonder about who is getting the money and why are they getting the money. Are we talking... Obviously, we cannot compensate those who were enslaved because they're dead. Should we be compensating those who are the descendants of those who were enslaved? And that's when it gets complicated and rather ticklish to deal with. Because if you look at the average incomes of the countries of the Caribbean, Haiti accepted, the Bahamas, Barbados, Jamaica and so on, their average yearly income is some 12 times what the income pertains in the countries from which they originated. Their Human Development Index is far, far higher if you look at the United Nations means of looking at how long you live, what your health is, how much education you get. They are far, far better off. So it's kind of not compensation in the strict way that we understand it. Now, I'm not one of those people who say they should give us money as a consequence of that legacy. I think that would probably be pushing it too far. But I think, no, time moves on. We do have to look... I slightly agree with the Labour Party's stance on this, that we do need to be aware of what happened in the past. We need to talk about slavery honestly. I talk to too many kids who are 18, 19, 20 years old who tell me that Britain invented slavery and were just about the only people who did it. It's an absurdity. As you people will know, we were slaves in the 9th century here to the Vikings. And just one more thing. When this slavery was taking place, my great-great-great-grandfather and his relatives and his family were hacking away at coal in the Durham coalfields. They gained nothing. My family gained nothing from that. Why, therefore, should we pay? And that's the bottom line, as I see it.
Jake Berry.
Well, thank you. I listened to the words of His Majesty the King today as he's head of the Commonwealth, and he was at the Commonwealth House of Government, and he very wisely said that we need to use respectful words to discuss this, but not fuel division. And I would go one step further and say that actually we need truth and reconciliation on this issue rather than to make payment. We need to look back, when we have that frank discussion about the history of Britain and slavery, we need to look back and acknowledge that Britain, 217 years ago, was one of the first countries around the world to make slavery illegal. And in fact, in 1845, we empowered the Royal Navy to attack any slave ship at all, even if they were allies of ours, and many of them were, that they found on the high seas as a pirate. We invaded Brazil. We invaded other countries on the Red Sea to stop them taking part in slavery. And as recently as 1920, the Royal Navy was patrolling to stop slavery in its oldest form in Somalia, which is one of the last places it was abolished. Tens of thousands of British sailors died in that righteous fight to stop slavery. And as abhorrent as the practice may be, and I don't think anyone would label it as anything other than that, we should to some extent be proud of Britain's leading role in its abolition. But what I wish CHOGM, the Commonwealth heads of government, would pay attention to is the 50 million people now living in modern-day slavery tonight as we make this programme. It is more than were enslaved under the height of the transatlantic slave trade. And according to the Global Slavery Index, 8 million of those people live in India, 3.19 million of those people live in Pakistan, 1.39 million of those modern-day slaves live in Nigeria. So when the Commonwealth heads of government come together to talk about the historic legacy of slavery and whether we should pay reparations, I hope they will spend more time and more effort discussing how we free people living in slavery today. And some of those countries I've mentioned, in fact, all of them are current members of the Commonwealth. And I want to know what they're doing to flee those slaves who are living today.
Thank you very much.
If I could just pick up on a couple of points that have been raised here. The first is that talking about the British abolition story, one thing that I think not enough people know about the Royal Navy experience is that by law, for a large period of time when they were operating and patrolling for slave ships, when they captured those slave ships, the people on board were either forcibly enlisted into the armed forces or were made indentured labourers for a period of 14 years. There's a great historical study. It's 180,000 of these so-called recaptives. 55,000 of them ended up in the British West Indies, mainly in the sugar colonies of Jamaica and Trinidad and British Guyana. This is not to deny that there was a powerful moral campaign in this country led by both black and white abolitionists to abolish the slave trade and slavery itself. But this is just to acknowledge that it's complicated, that issues of capitalism and empire were layered over some of those moral imperatives. And I think it's important that we don't tell too triumphalist a story about what we did, because it might seem that the moral stain was wiped clean. And then the second thing I'll just say quickly on the issue of who pays and what that looks like. I think it's important to recognise this is becoming increasingly mainstream. The Church of England has put up £100 million of its own money as compensation. The University of Glasgow, £20 million. These are institutions that have looked at their history and said, we directly financially benefited. That benefit clearly is traceable today, and we should pay compensation. So I think that's a great place to start.
There's some of the, the estimates for the financial cost of reparations vary widely, but you are talking tens of billions, up to trillions of pounds potentially involved in the cost of reparations. Rod Liddle.
Contrary to what Eleanor said, I think we should be triumphalist. I think there are things in our past which we have to cherish, and one of those is that it was a moral imperative. It was a moral drive which came from the church, and particularly the nonconformist church, and which set the standard for the rest of the world, even if an awful lot of Africa and Asia continued with the disgusting practice of slavery for many, many years which followed. That was something we did which we have a right to be proud of.
OK. Thank you all very much. If you want to continue this discussion, an important discussion, then we would like you to do so. Any answers? 03700 100 444 is the number that you need. The line's open at 12:30 p.m. on Saturday. Anita Arnand is in the chair. She would love to hear from you. Do get in touch. Right, on to our next. It comes from Councillor Paul Edgeworth. Hello, Councillor Edgeworth.
Is next week's budget going to introduce the new age of austerity?
Councillor Edgeworth, a Liberal Democrat councillor, I should say, from the local area. Thank you very much for your question. Is next week's budget, much trailed, the source of much speculation, is it going to introduce a new age of austerity? Eleanor Shearer.
I think there's a real risk, and actually I think in the North East in particular you can kind of see in microcosm some of the issues, the fact that councils around here are facing a £200 million deficit in spending by 2027. It really is a reminder that for all that we've been seeing some welcome reports of changes to fiscal rules to unlock up to £50 billion worth of capital investment to be clear that our economy desperately needs because we've been facing decades of stagnation and underinvestment. But we mustn't neglect the fact that the budget also needs to look at day-to-day spending. The polling on this is really clear. What the public wanted when they voted for change in the summer was an improvement to public services. I think everyone can see the effects of restrained spending in these services,
right.
The fact that schools are crumbling, the fact that it's hard to get a hospital appointment. So I think it is really important that this isn't a new age of austerity.
So how then do you pay for it? The question. We have already heard tax rises are coming. Where should those tax rises fall, if indeed that is how you pay for public services?
I think it's really important to be looking at taxes on wealth and not on work. Real wages have stagnated. Real wages have stagnated while the richest 1% have seen their incomes go up by £2.2 million each since 2010. So what we should be looking at is things like equalising capital gains tax with the rate of income tax, making sure that it's just a matter of simple fairness. When you look at the fact that someone like Rishi Sunak, who made £2.2 million last year alone, is paying the same effective tax rate as our teacher, it just cannot be fair that someone who is going out to work every day to earn their income is paying the same tax rate as someone that's living off their assets.
Catherine McKinnell.
So, I mean, in a direct answer to the question, no, this is not going to be a return to austerity. This budget is going to be about fixing the foundations of our economy that we know is really struggling. We've been in a doom loop for 14 years of high tax, low growth, and particularly as well, I think the instability that we've seen for quite a number of years have really made growth extremely difficult, and that includes places like here in the North East. So in our first budget in 15 years for the Labour Party, we know we need to be honest, and we have been quite upfront about some of the challenges that we face. We have mentioned many times the inherited finances that we took on, and actually they were worse than we expected in terms of a big gap in spending promises that were not actually budgeted for, and we do need to find the way to pay for that. Because the one thing that we will not do is leave the taxpayer paying for the mistakes of governments not setting budgets that are balanced and that are fair. But one thing that we are really committed to is our public services, and we know that our public services are the foundation of how we will drive growth, which is why in our very first steps in government we have prioritised restoring the pay in the teaching workforce in the NHS.
Okay.
We need to make sure that we fund our public services, but we need to get the economy to grow in order to really achieve that.
I just want to be clear on a couple of points. So we know the Chancellor said she's going to change her fiscal rules, which means she's going to potentially free up money for borrowing, which would be for capital spending, investment, not day-to-day spending. She's been very clear that day-to-day spending budget, which puts the money into public services, is still tight, and we have been very clear that taxes are going to have to go up to pay for it. So to the point that Eleanor made, are those taxes going to be on wealth or work?
So, I mean, first of all, I must caveat that you cannot tempt me into anticipating the budget. We've got a week to go, and I appreciate it is very anticipated, the first Labour budget in 15 years. So you can't tempt me into that.
Could you give us a definition of working people then?
It's more than my job is worth to anticipate the budget statement. I think it's really important, actually, that we respect that process. But we've been very clear, and Jake has anticipated what I'm going to say, which is that we will not put up national insurance, VAT and income tax on people that go out to work and work really hard, and that we know that the last 14 years have really impacted in terms of their ability to manage their household finances.
You've been clear in saying that you won't raise national insurance, income tax or VAT on working people. I think you've been less clear on what a working person is. Can you help?
So I think people recognise that when you go out to work or you work from home and you earn a wage, and by being very clear that we're not going to put national insurance up on that, we're not going to put income tax on that, and we're not going to put VAT, because we know VAT is one of those taxes that is disproportionately paid the lower you are on the income scale. So we want to make sure that people who we know have been really struggling for the last 14 years, and particularly in the last few years where inflation has had a really big impact. People's mortgages have gone up. People have been struggling to pay their energy bills. We don't want to make that any harder, because we know actually they're the people that need to go out in Sunderland and have a great time and be able to spend time boosting the city's economy. And we had the fantastic growth summit here, where we leveraged in £63 billion of the investment summit that we had in London. But
in
we had
London, not in Sunderland.
But we had a great growth summit here in Sunderland as well, because actually that growth needs to spread right across the country, and there's so much opportunity here, but we need people to be able to actually go out and enjoy it.
Catherine, thank you. I am going to interrupt you because I must let the other panellists in. Jake Berry, you've heard what the government says. They have been landed with the inheritance your party left them, and that is why this budget is so tough.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that. So, I mean, just to sort of hit that nail on the head of the alleged £22 billion black hole, I think nearly half of it was the public sector pay rises that the government chose to make, and the other half of it was largely made up of capital projects. And we've just heard from the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, this week that by a sleight of hand with mathematics, she's found 50 billion quid down the back of that red sofa in the Treasury. So I'm not quite sure why they still need to be taking the winter fuel payment away from some of the poorest pensioners in this country.
But just to be clear on that point again, hang on, Jake, because you're conflating 2 points there.
Well, no, we're not, because
the
actually,
£50 billion that has been freed up is for capital investment, not for day-to-day spending. So,
as I said, a lot of the £22 billion alleged black hole, I think we could spend a whole programme discussing whether it's true or not, was on capital projects. They've now released £50 billion, so query why they are still taking £1,500 from the poorest pensioners in this Parliament by way of removing the winter fuel payment. What we didn't hear from Catherine is what is this definition of working people? And we've had 3 definitions this week. We had, I think it was Stephen Kinnock said that someone who earns a 6-figure salary cannot be a working person. We've had a definition saying that landlords apparently cannot be a working person. And today we had a definition from Downing Street that people who own shares can't be a working person. Now, I think all of those are untrue. And in fact, if you think about people who work for our post office, our Royal Mail, they are shareholders in the business. Crikey, if you work for Wetherspoons, you get given shares in Wetherspoons after you've worked there for 2 years. So the reason the Labour Party has got themselves in a Gordian knot about this is the fundamental basis of it is a lie. They said they would not raise taxes on people when they knew they would have to. And I think that's why they're in such a mess of it. And to answer the question very directly, are we going to enter a new age of austerity? I'm sorry to say, I think the answer to that is yes. And the answer to that isn't because the government's going to cut public spending because it wants to. It's going to cut public spending because it has to. Because there is this phenomenon called Wexit, which is wealth exiting the UK. And if we look at people's fears about what is going to happen with taxation in this country, the only country that has got more people leaving it because they fear tax is China. In fact, fewer people have left Putin's Russia than have left Starmer's Britain because they're nervous about tax. Let me just say...
I just want to be clear, Jake Berry. You're suggesting that the state of the public finances is nothing to do with the previous administration. It's to do with the policies that Labour's introduced since July.
Well, no, they were left with the... So if we talk about the situation that Labour inherited, they inherited inflation at 2%, they inherited the fastest growing economy in the G7 and unemployment at a record low. But just to come back to this point about the fairness that Eleanor raised, currently in the UK, 10% of taxpayers pay 60% of income tax. In fact, for the government, every £3 the government receives, every 3 and every £10 the government receives, is just paid by 300,000 people in this country. If we go down the route that's been suggested, taxing capital gains tax, putting income tax, not protecting high earners, it will impoverish Britain. And what that means is a new age of austerity driven by a collapse in tax revenues that we are already seeing because of the fear of this budget.
OK. Rod Liddle.
Yeah, I think the one area where Jake is right is that Labour has boxed itself in. And it boxed itself in by performing various contortions during the run-up to the election, which led to it saying that no taxes would be raised, that income tax would not be raised. And I think that's the problem you've got. And the truth is, and I went out on the stump, both at this election, obviously, when I was standing, but also back in 2019 when Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party. And I can tell you that whilst people had a kind of natural revulsion towards Magic Grandpa, Jeremy, as we called him at the time, there was no such revulsion towards John McDonnell's fairly radical tax proposals. Most of the working people who I spoke to, and working people, I mean people, I mean, I suppose there may be some lounge lizards lying around who are deserving of an increase in everything that can possibly be done to them. But there was no objection whatsoever to a rise in the tax rate. And my guess is that if I asked you today, do you think the top rate of tax should be increased by, say, 1% or 2%, I would probably find a majority in favour of that. There is no great resistance to the idea of tax rises, apart from in the Daily Mail. And that's the only place you'll find it. My other worry, and this is a worry, because in an attempt to get out of this problem which Labour has cooked up for itself, we're now talking about a freeze on the amount of money which qualifies one to get into each band. In short, what will happen...
The income tax threshold, you mean?
The income tax threshold.
What's being mooted is the threshold to be frozen, which would effectively drag people into paying more tax for longer.
So that's what's been mooted, and we don't know, and I know you can't tell us tonight. But if that is the case, then you're taking money away. Effectively, you're taxing them more. You're taking money away from a section of the economy which is pretty hard hit. Those people on the middle band of the tax have not had it easy, and you're suddenly putting them effectively, there will be more people paying more tax at a rate which they shouldn't be, whereas it's the top rate of tax that needs to be increased, not the middle rate. And I also agree, incidentally, it should be about wealth and not...
Eleanor, ever so briefly.
Just to push back on the idea that if we raise taxes on wealth, there are all these individuals that are going to leave. I mean, the evidence just doesn't stack up about this, either internationally or here. In Norway, when they put their rate of wealth tax up to 1.1%, they saw tax revenues rise in the years following. And in the UK itself, in 2017, when we did reforms to our non-dom tax status, actually we saw tax receipts go up by 150%. So I just don't think that it's credible.
Rod Liddle, very briefly.
They are uneven.
That's exactly right. Some people do go. I don't know if you remember back when Labour came into office in '97, Phil Collins said he would go, and he did. And I think we were all fairly relieved about that.
But I mean, just to pick up on that point very quickly, in a post-COVID world where most people's business is a mobile phone and a telephone, if they run a firm or they're one of these elusive high earners that we're talking about, they can live anywhere. And it's all very well to say they won't leave. The fact of the matter is, They are. And the real danger, it's not like the 1970s when the business owners left. We are hollowing out the middle managers, the people who will drive our economy in the future. We are damaging our economy for 20 years, not for a few months.
Catherine McKinnell, you've heard what the panel have had to say. I appreciate you're not going to divulge the details of the budget as much as we might want you to, but answer some of the criticisms you've heard.
So, I mean, I can't just let what Jake said go without just being horrified by the suggestion that the mess that we inherited is somehow nothing to do with the 14 years of government and the total chaotic budget that, in fact, he was very supportive of Liz Truss as leader, was the party chairman, and we are all paying the price for that on our mortgages, on the impacts that came from that. So that is, Labour will not do that. This Labour government is really committed to creating a really stable economic plan, and we appreciate it is tough. We have inherited tough circumstances, but we are determined to grow the economy so that everybody's living standards can improve, and that is what I know that Rachel Reeves, as Chancellor, is determined to deliver.
Catherine,
this
Thank
week.
you. Hang on.
Your own assessment says that the changes to employment law will cost the economy £4.6 billion.
No. We've got to leave it there. We've got to leave it there because we must move on to other questions. We've spoken about the budget a lot, only a few days to go. I suspect we'll be speaking about it again when we know what's actually going to be in it. But in the meantime, if you want to join in the discussion, phone any answers 03700 100 444. Right, let's move on to our next, which comes from Ian Henderson. Hello, Ian.
Hello. What would be the impact on the UK if Donald Trump were elected US President on the 5th of November?
Ian, thank you. So, Donald Trump, of course, Kamala Harris, the two candidates for the US President. A couple of weeks until we know who is going to win. What would be the impact on the UK if it were to be Donald Trump? Rod Liddle.
It depends what part of the UK you're talking about. If you're talking about, for example, the government, it would be catastrophic, because through a series of maladroit pieces of diplomacy, the government has made it absolutely clear to someone who could be, God forgive us, leading the free world, that they have no time for him, that they believe he's a fascist and who sympathises with Nazis, etc., etc. It would be catastrophic for this government. It is usually the case, as far as Great Britain's concerned, that we do better out of Republican governments than out of Democrat governments, partly for various complex reasons about imperialism and also the Irish question as well, which has always rankled in the past. Generally, were it not for the fact that Labour has managed to estrange itself from Trump, I see this election as the unelectable versus the totally unelectable. It depresses me enormously. I think Kamala Harris is remarkably inept. And I believe that Donald Trump is a right-wing authoritarian Morlock. But one caveat to that is that you ought to look at the difference between what Trump, in his Brobdingnagian manner, says and what his governments actually do. And there is no doubt, to my mind, that a Trump presidency would probably be marginally safer for the world than a Kamala Harris presidency. And if you remember, it was Trump who introduced the Abraham Accords. Now, if Barack Obama had introduced the Abraham Accords, they'd probably have bunged him another Peace Prize. That was a genuine achievement, and what Trump says and what he does are often very different.
OK. Catherine McKinnell, on some of what Rod Liddle said there about the potential relationship that your government would have with a President Trump-elect if that were to be the outcome of the US election. Of course, we've had this week him making a complaint about Labour Party staffers going out to campaign for Kamala Harris, but we have also had comments from people like the current Foreign Secretary about Donald Trump's character in the past. What do you think that relationship would be like? To the point of the question, what would be the impact on the UK?
So, I mean, I disagree with what Rod said. Keir Starmer had dinner with Trump in New York just a couple of weeks ago. And so in terms of diplomacy and building that relationship, that speaks for itself. But for me, the special relationship between the UK and the USA is so fundamental for our national security and our prosperity that it goes much deeper and wider than whoever is in the White House or whoever is in number 10. And it goes very deep and is very long-lasting. And that joint commitment to democracy and upholding its principles goes very deep. So, you know, the government and the Labour Party will always be driven by what's in Britain's national interest. So we will build that relationship, and it's already being built.
Could you let David Lammy know that? Just if you get the chance. Because the other thing, I mean, you've sent 200 people, or 100 people, however
100 was in the advert. We don't know how many went.
Sent over there. You know, back when I was working for the Labour Party in the 1980s, you know, as a researcher, a couple of people went over to help in the Dukakis campaign. Yeah. But yours was coordinated by the national organiser of the Labour Party, and you are being investigated by the Federal Commission on Elections. I mean, it is such a maladroit step when you're dealing with someone who could be the next leader of the free world. I just don't understand it.
I mean, Catherine McKinnell, just on that specific point about the people who went out there.
Happy to answer. As far as I'm aware, the trips that people went on were, I mean, these are serious political interested people. Some might say nerds, who travel in their own time, in their holidays, at their own expense. That is their holiday.
Accommodation was being paid for.
No, I mean, and they go and meet with fellow political enthusiasts in other countries and are, put up by volunteers. That's what happens in UK elections around the country. It's what people who care about politics and democracy do. And as far as I'm concerned, that's all it is. I'm not aware of anything other than that.
Okay. You're sorting out their accommodation. It said, we will sort your accommodation out for you.
On a voluntary basis.
Hang on, thank you.
When you did
Jake
it
Berry.
in the 1980s, the Labour Party was in opposition.
Yes,
and
indeed.
it speaks to the naivety, I think, of the Foreign Secretary and the Labour Party, that they don't think this is electoral interference. Now, Catherine is absolutely correct.
Well, hang on, can I just be clear? You do think this is electoral interference?
Yeah,
because
and
this has been...
This
kind of thing has gone on for a long time.
The UK governing party recruiting volunteers to go and campaign for one side in a important and divisive national election, even if it isn't technically electoral interference, it kind of looks like a duck, walks like a duck and quacks like a duck. So it really does seem like there is a legitimate thing to be looked into here. And I just think it speaks to the naivety and the failure of the Labour Party actually to properly transition from being an opposition party to a government representing Britain on the international stage.
I mean, I don't want to get too historical, but in 1992, wasn't there talk about some of John Major's team then flying out to help what was then the George H.W. Bush campaign?
I've seen that report in The Spectator. I've spoken to the individual named, and it is absolutely factually incorrect.
Not if it's in The Spectator, sorry.
So says the associate editor, just to remind you.
Oh, well, I think you're getting the letter later, Rod. But more just on the sort of, the inability of the Labour Party to transition into government, it is ridiculous that we have a foreign secretary who has described Donald Trump as a neo-Nazi. Even if you thought it, there is such a thing called diplomacy, and I appreciate he was in opposition when he did this, but for Keir Starmer to give him that job, knowing that there was a good chance that Donald Trump would be elected, I think shows real naivety, both the Foreign Secretary and Keir Starmer. And it matters, by the way, thank you for it. It matters because the UK special relationship, both strategically and economically, is probably the most important relationship that Britain has. And any government, whichever political party are in power in the UK, whoever is in power in the USA, should foster, nurture and, continue to grow that special relationship.
OK, just ever so briefly on the David Lammy comments, Catherine McKinnell, that he did make them in opposition, and I think he himself has said that a lot of people have said things about Donald Trump in the past. But do you have any concerns to the point that Jake Berry raised?
I think the last point Jake made was the correct one, which is we should foster those relationships, and we are, and we do, and we will. And I think the power of a government developing that relationship with the USA is really important and something we're absolutely committed and focused on.
Okay.
And you know, people will have had different opinions over that. It's been a very interesting few years in politics, let's be honest, and there have been a lot of opinions expressed, but I think that fundamental importance of building those relationships in government is something that is already happening and we are absolutely committed to.
Thank you. Eleanor Shearer, you've been waiting very patiently. I'm going to remind you of the question. What would be the impact on the UK if Donald Trump were elected?
Well, I appreciate the question. I think that because the election outcome is a bit of a coin toss, it's a bit of a fool's errand to speculate exactly who might be in the White House next year. But I did want to raise a point that I think the Labour Party could be reflecting on regardless of who wins the election, which is that unfortunately there's not a huge amount of space between the Democrats and the Republicans when it comes to the enabling of the actions of the Netanyahu government in Gaza and in Lebanon. And I think Labour needs to take seriously the fact that if they do, as they say, want to put Britain back on the global stage, having a close relationship with the US on this particular issue puts them out of step with the UN, with the ICJ, with large parts of Europe that are recognising the state of Palestine and with much of the global south. So I do think there is a bit of a tension there that the Labour Party should reflect on.
Okay. Thank you all. I want to move on. We've only got about 6 minutes left on the programme, but I really want to get to this next question because a few people asked along these lines. It comes from Derek Watson.
Good evening, panel. Can a reversal of visa restrictions provide a much-needed life jacket to sinking UK universities?
Derek, I think I'm right in saying you work at the University of Sunderland.
Yes.
What have you noticed at the moment? What's going on there, briefly?
Well, we're investing significantly in our buildings infrastructure. We've got an expanding medical school, and we've been very agile in our approach for our international centres, 27 centres around the world. So we're drawing on other markets to compensate potential shortfalls of international students.
But there is still pressure on budgets, staff potentially going, and I think some courses potentially closing as well.
I think all universities are recalibrating.
Thank you very much. So a bit of context. Of course, we saw changes to the visa requirements for students which limit the dependents that they could bring. Since then, there has been a fall in the number of international students, and many universities are saying this is creating a bit of a funding crisis, coupled with the fact that fees haven't increased for some time. Only about 5 minutes on what's an important subject, but I just want to get key thoughts from the panel about whether specifically we should look again at those visa restrictions. Jake Berry, it was the last government that introduced them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry to say I don't think we should look at them again. I think coming to study in fantastic academic institutions like you represent here in the UK is an amazing privilege, but that's not the same thing as being able to bring the entirety of your family over with you just because you are studying. Now, I want universities to succeed, but we have a massive issue with net inward migration into this country, and I think it was a reasonable step for the government to take to try and control that. And why that matters is we are creating a city about the size of Leeds every single year just through migration. Now, we think about Leeds, fine Yorkshire city. It has 300 schools, 7 hospitals, 94 GP surgery, 290 nurseries, 600,000 homes in it. No government of any political hue is building infrastructure at that rate. And what that means if you live in the UK is your ability to go to one of those schools, get a home, see a doctor, get your kid into a nursery.
I'm sorry to rush you, but we haven't got bags of time. But can you just be clear then, if you wouldn't look again at the visa...
we shouldn't reverse.
No, but therefore, would you look at then increasing tuition fees?
Well, that's not a decision to me. I hear rumoured that the Labour Party is about to do it, which doesn't surprise me, because Keir Starmer stood on a manifesto when he wants to be leader to abolish them, and now apparently he's going to increase them.
We can ask them in just a moment. Eleanor Shearer.
Yeah, I think the UK's higher education sector is one of the great assets of this country. It's one of the things in which we are genuinely world leading, and I think that Labour has an opportunity to break with the toxic rhetoric of the last government, which often seemed hostile to higher education in general. I think it was narrow-minded to restrict student visa numbers, creating the funding crisis that we see now. But I think it is important that we look at sustainable funding for the sector as a whole to make sure that we're not restricting both the life chances and ambitions of young people for whom it's so essential to get an education, but also economic growth. This is a real opportunity for us. Labour's got a growth mission. They should meet it.
Thank you.
No, I don't think there should be a relaxation of the visa rules. And even more so, I don't think that our universities should be allowed to put up their tuition fees. I think we have perpetrated a giant fraud on young people in Great Britain today in charging them vast amounts of money to end up with a degree which sadly doesn't get them a terribly well-paying job and saddles them with debt for the rest of their lives. I am in favour of abolishing tuition fees.
So then how do you fund universities?
By reducing the number of universities. And frankly, I'm really sorry for the gentleman there, but if this was the steel industry, which was so badly mismanaged that you found yourself in this position, if it was the coal mines...
Rod, I've got to stop you because we've got to let Catherine McKinnell come back, and we've got a minute left. Catherine.
So universities are a key part of our mission to create opportunity in every part of the country, and University of Sunderland is a fantastic example of the opportunities that it gives.
Just on the question, Catherine, I'm so sorry we're short of time.
On the visas, we need a fair visa system. I tell you what we're not going to do. We're not going to make slogans and sweeping statements. We're going to look at this properly. We're going to review and make sure we have a fair visa system in this country that works for this country.
So you'll look at the
visas
visas.
Coming here. But in terms of the funding, we need a fair funding system. There is no doubt about that. It has
Catherine,
not been looked
we've
at
got
for some
10
time.
seconds, so you're looking at the funding
system. It needs a really
system.
comprehensive approach. And I guess what I would ask is patience.
There
Because
we
I
are.
appreciate everyone wants the message.
I have to ask your patience, Catherine. We are about to drop off air. Thank you all so very much for your time, and thank you here for listening.